Virginia, 1859. Colonel Nathaniel Ashford owned 300 souls, 300 bodies he believed were his by divine right. But on that March morning, he was searching for something rare. In the Charleston market, amidst screams and despair, he saw her. Skin as white as porcelain, hair the color of snow, red eyes, an albino slave, 18 years old, a virgin, the seller assured him. Nathaniel paid the price of 5 slaves. It wasn't a purchase. It was a wedding gift for his son Thomas, who would be turning 25. Thomas would inherit everything, but he needed to prove he was a man, and that pale creature would be his initiation, his right of ownership. Nathaniel smiled at the thought of the surprise, but he didn't know that some gifts destroy those who receive them, and that the human heart, even corrupted, can still bleed. What happened on that plantation changed 3 destinies forever. And the truth had been hidden for 18 years. Please comment on where you are listening from now, because this story has just crossed a point of no return. She was delivered on her birthday, washed, perfumed, dressed in simple white fabric, like a lamb for the slaughter. The colonel gathered the family in the main room of the manor house. His wife, Margaret, looked on with disguised disgust. The 2 daughters averted their eyes. But Thomas froze when he saw her enter. She kept her eyes on the floor, as she had been taught through beatings, but something about her radiated a dignity that no chain could break. Her name, they said, was Pearl, an ironic name for something everyone treated as valuable trash. The colonel placed his hand on his son's shoulder, proud, expectant. He said that property was his now, to do with as he pleased, when he pleased, how he pleased. The words echoed through the room like a death sentence. Margaret served wine. The daughters feigned smiles, and Pearl remained motionless, breathing slowly, preparing herself for the horror that would come when night fell. But when the family dispersed, and Thomas was finally alone with her, he did nothing. He only looked. He looked as if he were witnessing a miracle or a ghost. The following days were strange. Thomas ordered a room to be prepared for Pearl, not in the slave quarters, not in the basement, but in a small back room of the main house, but with a window. He had a real bed brought in, a clean blanket, a jug of fresh water. The slaves whispered in confusion. Margaret began to complain to her husband. Nathaniel ordered his son to behave like a man and use the property for what it was meant for. But Thomas didn't touch Pearl. He only talked to her. He asked where she came from, what her real name was, if she liked music. Pearl answered with monosyllables at first, suspicious, expecting the trap. But his questions were genuine. He didn't look at her as an object. He looked at her as one looks at a person, and that was more dangerous than any violence, because it gave hope, and hope in a slave was the cruelest form of torture. 3 weeks after her birthday, Pearl made the fatal mistake. She smiled. It was only for a second, an involuntary reaction to a silly story Thomas told. But he saw it, and something inside him broke completely. Thomas began spending hours locked in his office, writing. He stopped having dinner with his family. He refused dates with the daughters of neighboring farmers whom his father arranged as potential wives. He only wanted to be near Pearl. And Pearl, who had learned since childhood that white kindness was always a prelude to cruelty, began to lower her guard. He brought her books. He taught her to read in secret at night, by candlelight, a crime punishable by mutilation, they both knew. But he insisted that she deserved to know how to read her own name. Not Pearl, the name they gave him as a label, but Ayana, her true African name which her mother had whispered before dying on the slave ship. Thomas repeated, Ayana, it means beautiful flower, and for the first time in 18 years, she felt human. Colonel Nathaniel watched everything from afar, with growing concern. This wasn't domination. It was worse. It was affection. And affection between master and slave wasn't only dangerous socially. It was an abomination that could destroy the Ashford name forever. He needed to act, but he didn't yet know how. It was Margaret who first gave the warning. She entered her son's room without knocking and found Pearl sitting in a chair, reading. A slave reading. Margaret lost her composure. She shouted that it was obscene, anti-Christian, a crime against the natural order. Thomas placed himself between his mother and Pearl, and for the first time in his life raised his voice to the woman who had raised him. He said that Pearl was not an animal, that she had a soul, that she felt. Margaret looked at her son with genuine horror, as if he had confessed to murder. She slammed the door and ran to her husband. That night, Colonel Nathaniel summoned his son for a conversation in his office. He was direct. "You are interfering with the property. This needs to stop." Thomas responded with something he had never said to his father. "No." The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Nathaniel felt his control slipping. What he had given as a gift was turning into a curse. He tried to reason with his son. He explained the law, society, the Bible, but Thomas simply replied, "What if the law is wrong?" Nathaniel knew he had lost his son. Now all that remained was to decide what to do with the albino slave girl who had poisoned his mind. Tension in the big house grew like a summer storm. The slaves felt it, the overseers gossiped, the town began to whisper. Colonel Ashford's son was sick because of a slave. Some laughed, others were indignant, but everyone agreed this couldn't continue. Margaret begged her husband to sell Pearl immediately. Nathaniel considered it, but there was a problem. If he sold the slave now, his son would never forgive him. And Thomas was the sole heir. The farm, the land, the legacy. Everything depended on him. Nathaniel was trapped in his own trap. He had bought that slave to make his son a man, but she had made his son into something else, a traitor to his own class. And the worst part? Nathaniel saw in Thomas's eyes something he himself had lost decades ago: humanity. Then came the news that would change everything. The old family doctor, Dr. Harrison, appeared at the farm with a grave expression. He needed to talk about the albino slave, about Pearl, about who she really was. And when he finished speaking, Colonel Nathaniel Ashford turned pale, because some truths are heavier than any chain. If this scene has already caused you outrage, click the subscribe button and activate the bell so you don't miss anything. Dr. Harrison was 72 years old. He had attended 3 generations of the Ashford family. He had seen births, deaths, buried secrets. But that secret, that one he had kept for 18 years, because he swore he would take it to the grave, until he saw the albino slave girl on that plantation. He asked Nathaniel to sit down. Then he asked, "Do you remember the spring of 1841, when you were 23 and engaged to Margaret?" Nathaniel frowned, confused. Of course he remembered. It was the year his father died and he inherited everything, the year he became colonel. The doctor continued, "Do you remember the young slave girl who worked in the kitchen, the fair-skinned African woman your father had bought from a newly arrived ship?" Nathaniel's face changed. He remembered. He remembered bright eyes, youthful curves, nights when Margaret was not yet on the plantation, and he felt powerful, invincible, with a divine right to everything that was his. He remembered calling her to the big house. He remembered her crying softly. He remembered doing what every master did. What was his right? He didn't remember her name. He never knew, but he remembered her body. Dr. Harrison said softly, "She got pregnant. By you." Nathaniel jumped to his feet. Impossible. He had ordered that slave sold soon after. He didn't even know where. He didn't want problems before the wedding. He didn't want bastards complicating the inheritance. But the doctor shook his head. "She was sold 5 months pregnant. I examined her myself. The buyer was a farmer from South Carolina who didn't care. She gave birth on the way, a girl, premature, small, and albino." The world stopped. Nathaniel felt the ground disappear from beneath his feet. The doctor continued, "Albinism is rare, but it happens. She inherited African genetics from her mother, and from you. Well, from you, she inherited something that marked her forever. I learned of her existence from a medical colleague in Charleston. He mentioned the albino slave with red eyes who was being auctioned, a rarity. I wasn't sure until I saw her here, But now I have no doubt. The doctor paused. Then he completed the sentence that shattered Nathaniel. The slave you bought as a wedding gift for your son is your daughter. She is your firstborn, and Thomas is in love with his own half-sister. The silence that followed lasted an eternity. Nathaniel couldn't breathe. Everything made sense now. Thomas's inexplicable connection to her, the instinctive care, as if something in their blood recognized the kinship that society denied. Nathaniel had bought his own daughter. He had given his own daughter as a sexual object to his own son. And now Thomas was in love with her. The old colonel tried to rationalize. She was a slave. Genetics didn't matter. The law said that children of slaves were slaves. Property. They weren't family. They were nothing. But the nausea he felt was real. The guilt that crushed him was human. Dr. Harrison said he had only told him because he had seen Thomas with her, because he knew it would end in tragedy. Nathaniel begged the doctor never to tell anyone, that this secret would die with the two of them. The doctor agreed, but he asked a question that wouldn't leave Nathaniel's head. And what about them? Are you going to let it continue? Are you going to let your son get involved with his own sister? Nathaniel had no answer. Pure horror. Horror of himself, horror of what he had done, horror of the gift he had given. For 3 nights Nathaniel didn't sleep. He sat in his office drinking whiskey, trying to find a way out. He could sell Pearl away, but Thomas would find out and hate him forever. He could tell the truth, but that would destroy the family publicly. A master having a bastard daughter with a slave was common, but giving that daughter as a gift to his legitimate son, that was monstrous, even by the standards of the time. He could kill Pearl, make it look like an accident, illness, a failed escape. But the mere thought made him vomit, because now he no longer saw a slave. He saw blood of his blood. He saw the daughter he never knew. He saw the child he had condemned to slavery from the womb. Nathaniel realized, too late, that he had become the monster he always said he wasn't. He looked in the mirror and saw what he truly was. A man who had raped a defenseless woman, a father who had sold his own daughter before she was born, an aristocrat who had destroyed 2 lives to maintain appearances. And now he had to decide, tell the truth and destroy everything, or keep the secret and watch 2 young people love each other without knowing they were blood relatives. Thomas noticed the change in his father. Colonel Nathaniel avoided looking at Pearl. He locked himself in his office. He drank more. He aged before the family's eyes. Margaret thought it was illness. His daughters thought it was bad business. But Thomas suspected something. He knew his father. He knew when something was tormenting him. One afternoon, Thomas found Pearl alone in the small back room. She was reading a book he had given her. Upon seeing him, she smiled. And for the first time, Thomas said aloud what he had been feeling for weeks. "I love you." Pearl froze. Love. That word was forbidden, dangerous, fatal. She could be killed just for someone suspecting that a white man felt that way about her. But Thomas continued, "I know what I am. I know I was born on the wrong side of this curse. I know my family built everything on blood and pain, but I don't want to be like them. I want to be different, with you." Pearl felt tears welling up. For the first time in 18 years, she spoke what she felt. "You can't love me. I'm not a person for your world. I'm property, and property doesn't love back. Property only suffers." Thomas knelt before her. He held her hands, and he made an insane vow. "I'll set you free. I'll do the paperwork. I'll buy your freedom with my inheritance money. And when you're free, we'll leave, to the north, to somewhere where no one knows our names, where we can just be us." Pearl wanted to believe. God, how she wanted to. But she had learned that hope was the slowest poison. Still, for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to dream of a life where she wouldn't be merchandise, where her body would be hers, where she could love without it being a crime. They embraced that afternoon, and for a few hours, the world outside ceased to exist. But Colonel Nathaniel was watching from his office window, and he knew this couldn't continue, not because society wouldn't allow it, but because biology screamed the truth he was hiding. That night, he made the decision. He would tell everything, to Thomas, to Pearl, the whole truth, and he would let them decide what to do with the horror he had created. Do you think Thomas was weak or different from the others? Right, weak or different. The storm arrived one June night. The sky was black. Lightning ripped through the clouds, and the entire farm seemed to hold its breath. Nathaniel called Thomas and Pearl to the office. Margaret was sleeping with laudanum. The daughters had gone to visit relatives. It was just the three of them. Nathaniel poured himself some whiskey. His hands trembled. Thomas was tense, protective, his arms slightly in front of Pearl. Nathaniel looked at them both. He saw youth. He saw love. He saw innocence that he was about to destroy. He began slowly. He told of the spring of 1841, of the young slave who worked in the kitchen, of the nights when he, young, powerful, entitled, had done what every master did. Thomas paled. He knew that story. He knew what men of his class were capable of, but he never imagined that his own father. Pearl remained motionless, feeling the ground crumble beneath her. Nathaniel continued. He said he had sold the pregnant slave, that he never knew the child's name, that he didn't even care until the day he bought Pearl, until Dr. Harrison tells the truth. Thomas stood slowly. His voice was hoarse, trembling. You're saying that she is... Nathaniel simply nodded. Pearl covered her face with her hands. Her whole life flashed before her eyes. The brutal childhood, the owners who passed her off like an object, the white skin that everyone looked at with disgust and fascination. And now this, the truth that the man who had bought her was her biological father, and the man she had begun to love. Thomas recoiled. He looked at Pearl in horror, not horror at her, but at what this meant. He had fallen in love with his own sister, with his own blood. Not by choice, but by cruel fate. Colonel Nathaniel said, his voice broken, I am the monster. I did this. I created this curse. But now you know the truth, and you need to decide. Thomas shouted, Decide what? You destroyed everything. You turned what I felt into an abomination. Nathaniel didn't react. He just lowered his head, because he knew he deserved every word. The storm raged furiously outside, and inside that office 3 lives were being torn apart. Pearl finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but heavy with decades of pain. I always knew I couldn't have anything, not a name, not a body, not a future, but for the first time, I had hope, and now even that has been stolen from me. Narrator. Thomas turned to her, tears streaming down his face. I didn't know. Pearl, Ayanna, I swear I didn't know. Pearl looked at him with devastating tenderness. I know. None of us knew. But that doesn't change anything, does it? She turned to Nathaniel. The man who was her biological father, the man who had sold her before she was born, the man who had bought her as an obscene gift for his own son, and she told him the truth he needed to hear. You're not my father. A father protects. A father loves. You only made me, and then threw me into hell, so don't come now with guilt. Guilt doesn't free anyone. Guilt doesn't break chains. Nathaniel felt the words like whips. He fell to his knees, literally to his knees. The great Colonel Ashford, owner of 300 souls, kneeling before his enslaved daughter, he begged forgiveness. He said he would free her, that he would give her money, that he would do anything. But Pearl shook her head. Freedom given is not freedom. It's alms from someone who wants to sleep better at night. Thomas, still in shock, asked, So what do we do now? Pearl took a deep breath. She looked at the man she loved, and who was her brother. She looked at the man who fathered her and condemned her, and she made the only decision that was still hers. I'm leaving, alone, to the north, not with your papers, not with your money. I'm going to run away, as a slave, and I will succeed, because I've always been stronger than any of you. Thomas wanted to protest. Escape meant certain death if she were captured, but Pearl had already decided. She looked at him one last time. You taught me to read. You gave me back my name. You made me feel human, that I will take with me, but the rest needs to die here." She left the office, and none of them tried to stop her, because they all knew she was right. 3 hours later, Pearl disappeared into the night. No papers, no plan, nothing but her own courage. Nathaniel ordered that no foreman go after her. Thomas locked himself in his room, and the entire farm felt that something had changed forever, because the truth, once told, cannot be put back in a bottle. And 3 people now carried a secret that would destroy them in different ways. In the following days, Margaret realized something had happened. Her husband was visibly aging. Her son wasn't eating. The albino slave had disappeared. She asked. Nathaniel only said, "She ran away. We're not going to look for her." Margaret found it strange, but didn't insist. She had never liked that slave. It was good that she had left. The daughters returned from their trip. Life on the farm continued. But Thomas was dead inside. He had lost the woman he loved. He had discovered that she was his sister. He had understood that his family was built on atrocities so profound that not even God could forgive them. He started drinking. He stopped working. Margaret begged her husband to do something, but Nathaniel couldn't, because he knew that his son was paying for his sin. 2 weeks after the escape, a letter arrived. No return address. Just one line written in trembling but legible handwriting. "I arrived. I'm alive. Don't look for me." Thomas recognized the handwriting. It was Pearl, Ayanna. She had succeeded. Against all odds, she had crossed the border and arrived in the north. He wept as he read that line. He wept with relief, with loss, with an impossible love that would never die. Nathaniel read the letter afterward, and for the first time in decades, he also cried. He cried for the daughter he never knew, for the woman he had raped, for the son he had destroyed, for everything he had done in the name of power and property. He realized he had built an empire on blood, and that now that blood was exacting its price. Pearl's letter was the last communication. They never heard from her again. They didn't know if she had found peace, if she had found love, if she had found life. But Thomas liked to imagine that she was somewhere up north, reading books, saying her real name, living as a person, not as property. And every night, before going to sleep, he whispered, "Ayanna, it means beautiful flower," like a prayer, like an apology, like the only thing he could still offer the woman he loved and could never, ever have. Who was more cruel in this scene, the system or those who defend it? Give your opinion. Colonel Nathaniel Ashford was never the same again. The man who commanded 300 souls with an iron fist began to hesitate, to question, to see what had always been there, but which he chose to ignore. He saw Pearl in every young slave girl. He saw her mother in every dark-skinned woman who crossed his path. He saw his own crime multiplied in every man of his class who did exactly what he had done, and guilt devoured him alive. Margaret noticed the change. Her husband stopped going to social dinners. He stopped trading slaves. Once, she found him crying in his office. He never explained why. The daughters found it strange. Thomas distanced himself completely from the family. In 1860, when the tension between North and South began to escalate into the Civil War, Thomas did something unthinkable. He freed all the slaves under his responsibility on the lands that had already been transferred to his name. 47 people. He gave them manumission papers. He gave them money to start a new life. And when Margaret and Nathaniel found out, it was too late. The Ashford family's reputation plummeted. Neighbors avoided them. They called Thomas a traitor. They called Nathaniel weak for not controlling his son. But Nathaniel didn't react, because he knew that this was justice. Small, late, but justice nonetheless. The Civil War began in 1861. Virginia joined the Confederacy. Thomas refused to fight. He publicly stated that he would not take up arms to defend slavery. That was the final straw. The Ashford family was completely ostracized. Humiliated, Margaret fled with her daughters to relatives' home in Georgia. Nathaniel and Thomas were left alone on the farm. 2 men, haunted by different ghosts of the same woman. The war devastated the region. Soldiers passed through. Houses were burned. Slaves fled en masse. The Ashford farm, once a symbol of wealth, became ruins, and Nathaniel watched it all crumble without fighting, because he felt he deserved it. In 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was announced, Nathaniel heard the news sitting on the ruined porch of the main house. He thought of Pearl. He thought she was free now, not just in fact, but in law. Free by law, free as she should have been from birth. And he smiled, a sad smile full of regret, but he smiled, because at least that had happened. At least she had lived long enough to see it. Nathaniel Ashford died in 1865, a few months after the end of the war. He was 52 years old but looked 80. His body was bent, his eyes were empty. There was no one at the funeral besides Thomas. No neighbors, no friends, no slaves he had owned. He died alone, poor, broken. But before he died, he did one thing. He wrote a letter to Pearl, addressed simply, "To my daughter, wherever she may be." In that letter, he confessed everything. He asked for forgiveness. He said she had sisters. He said she was entitled to a surname he had denied her. And at the end, he wrote, "I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that you were stronger than all of us, and that I died knowing that." He never sent the letter. He didn't know where. So he left it with Thomas, with instructions that if he ever found Pearl, he should deliver it to her. Thomas kept the letter as a relic, and he continued living with the memory of the woman he loved, of the sister he never had, from the person who had transformed him into a better person simply by existing. Thomas never married. He never loved another person. He slowly rebuilt the farm, but now employed free laborers, paying fair wages. He became known in the region as the Mad Ashford, the man who had betrayed his class. But he didn't care, because he knew the truth. He knew the horror his family had perpetuated, and he refused to continue. In 1880, 15 years after his father's death, Thomas received an unexpected visit. A middle-aged, elegant black woman, accompanied by 2 teenage children. She said she had a message for him, from someone named Ayanna. Thomas's heart stopped. The woman said that Pearl had died 3 years earlier in New York. She had lived freely. She had married. She had had children. She had been a teacher at a school for black children. And before she died, she had asked that someone find Thomas and say, "Thank you for teaching me my name." Thomas broke down. He cried as he hadn't cried since the day she had run away. The woman left a photograph. Pearl, now in her 40s, smiling, surrounded by children, free, alive, human, everything she should always have been. Thomas framed that photograph. He placed it on the wall of the office that had once been the scene of so much pain. And every day before going to sleep, he looked at it and whispered, "Ayanna, it means beautiful flower." He died in 1889 at the age of 55, and he was buried next to his father under a tree on the old farm. There was no pomp, there was no glory, just 2 men who had learned too late that power without humanity is only violence, and that some pains once inflicted are never completely healed. The farm was sold. The Ashford family disappeared from history, but Nathaniel's letter survived. Thomas had kept it, and decades later a historian found it in a dusty archive. He published it, and for the first time, the true story of the Ashford family came to light. The story of a colonel who bought his own daughter, of a son who fell in love with his sister without knowing it, and of an enslaved woman who was stronger, more dignified, more humane than all her masters combined. The story of Pearl, of Ayanna, the beautiful flower that bloomed even in the ashes. Today, more than 150 years later, no Ashfords remain, no plantations remain, no chains remain, but the memory remains. The memory that slavery was not just an economic system, it was a machine for destroying souls on all sides, masters and slaves, parents and children, brothers and sisters. It corrupted everything it touched. and its scars still bleed to this day. Pearl never read Nathaniel's letter. She never knew he had repented. Perhaps it was better that way, because repentance doesn't undo chains. Guilt doesn't return stolen years, and forgiveness is not an obligation for those who suffered. But she knew in the end that Thomas never forgot her, that he had spent his entire life carrying the impossible love they shared for a few weeks, and perhaps that was enough. Not redemption, not a happy ending, but memory that she existed, that she resisted, that she lived, and that she was freer in her escape than any master on his property, because true freedom was never about papers. It was always about choice, and Pearl chose to live until her last breath. She chose to be human. If you could send a message to Pearl, Ayanna, after she managed to escape, what would you say? Leave it in the comments. Or do you think Thomas should have fought harder to stop her escape? Or was he right to let her go? Open debate in the comments.